welcome to the Borders and Globalization podcast. Welcome to our listeners. I'm speaking from the traditional territory of the Lekwungen peoples in the Salish Sea region. Today, we are pleased to welcome Elisabeth Vallet, who is director of the Observatory of Geopolitics at the University of Quebec in Montreal, and also professor of international studies at the Royal Military College of Saint-Jean. She works particularly on the American political system and on the theme of borders and border walls. She is also director of research for the Quebec branch of the Borders and Globalization project, and she edited several books about borders, for example, Borders, Fences and Walls in 2014, Borders and Border Walls in 2020. So our interview today will focus on the geopolitics of international borders and border fences. Welcome, Elisabeth Vallet.
Bonjour, merci. It's a pleasure to be here.
But before we begin, Professor, could you briefly share with our audience your academic profile and your research interests? Who are you? What's your main research about? And what do you do for research on borders?
Absolutely. Thank you. So my name is Elisabeth Vallet. I am working at the University of Quebec at Montreal. I've been here for almost 15 years at UQAM. I am an immigrant myself, coming from France. And I've been raised actually at the border of Switzerland and France. So borders have always been a part of my life. And after moving to Canada, I have been in the US for a year at Duke University, which was very interesting to be there. Actually, in 2002, 2003, right at a time where being a Francophone and a French, particularly in the US, wasn't always comfortable. And then after that, I came back to Canada, and I've been in Montreal ever since. I am, as you said, a professor both at UQAM. I'm a adjunct professor in geography at UQAM, and I head a Center of Geopolitics here with the Raoul Dandurand Chair. And I'm also a professor at the Collège Militaire Royal de Saint-Jean, the Royal Military College of Canada in Saint-Jean, where I teach geopolitics and world geography. And we are pretty close to the border here too, just a walk through from the Vermont border. So here again, borders are part of my life. And I had a team of researchers that have labeled themselves Team Geopo, and they've got this very superb identity as a group that they actually have almost constructed themselves, and so there is a sense of belonging, and the older ones do educate the younger ones into border studies and border field work. And so I've been traveling with them for a few years now. We've been going to Victoria. They are part of the Borders in Globalization project, and we will be going soon to the ABS Association for Borderland Studies conference. So that's about my profile and what I do in life. And we study borders, so the border between Quebec and the US, as well as border walls and borderlands. And we do work with a few colleagues, both in the big network, but also outside of the big network in the global south.
Thank you, Elisabeth Vallet, for this biography. My first question is related to what you have said about the Borders and Globalization project. What are the research tracks of this international program? And what are the results or the findings?
So this network has been set up by Emmanuel Brunejailly, who really came up with that idea that the Canada-US border was understudied, and he was right. So he gave us the mandate to delve into the very specific portion of the border between Quebec and the US, and his intuitions were absolutely right, because we soon enough discovered that actually not many people had studied that border. You had a few security studies around after 9/11, but most of it was either geographers or historians. And there is a lot of history, and there were a lot of things that actually we dug out because there are those stories about smuggling and brothels being right on the border, and all those almost like it's almost popular culture about um, almost like smugglers going through the field, the farm field, the farmers protecting the smugglers. You've got so many stories. It was so interesting to just look into this, but it was also interesting to see that actually nobody had really thought through the status, the actual status of that specific part of the border, which is characterized by almost a double insularity. One of them being linguistic. So being a francophone in Quebec means that crossing into the US has a very specific difficulty. And after 9/11, actually, some of the truckers that were had mastered English, but very functionally, but sometimes got caught into questions with border agents that made border crossing more difficult as security was tightened after 9/11. So that's really answered Emmanuel Brunet-Jailly's question, which was, do we need to study that border? Hell yes, we needed to. And we came up with a few answers or a few questions first. For instance, maple syrup is a border issue. And that was super interesting to see that if you are a Québécois, you may want to have a few maple trees on the other side of the border because the market is not administered in the same way than in Quebec. But then if you have maple trees on the other side, it means that you have to cross the border. And after 9/11, surely enough, it became super difficult. And so we have been able to go through the transactions that maple syrup producers have had to go through. And lobsters have also been the same kind of issues that we've seen. So that was one of the examples, which was almost the most. It was fun, we had to go during maple syrup season and visit those érablières, as we call them, and so we ate a lot while doing our own research. What was interesting also is to see that collaboration is a key feature of that. Vermont and Quebec have been for a long time very integrated in a sense, and those borderlands in the eastern township of Quebec, people do speak English. In the northern part of Vermont, people have French names. Sometimes French has faded away. English has taken over, but still, until very recently, you had people, Americans, that were sending their kids on the other side of the border to go to school because the French school was closer than the American school. So there is this integration and collaboration has been underlined by what happened with the Megantic train tragedy. And we've seen that collaboration was needed, if not effective. But at the same time, what we've been going through is those political electoral discourses and speeches we've seen at Congress, where the border between Quebec and Vermont has been labeled as being one that could be dangerous because it's not fully assessed. And it's been interesting to go through that complexity. And with COVID, actually, most of our findings have proven necessary because we've seen that the supply chains actually could be impeded by some border problems. So those truckers that were already facing some linguistic issues at the border have been facing even tougher issues in a way. But so what has happened with COVID has also shown that what we had seen about the post 9/11 border, which that it had become kind of a filter that would filter out certain flows. Well, that has been confirmed with COVID. And we've been going through those electoral campaigns and the discourses about the border, and what we should be taking into account into our the way we will look at that specific issue in the future is that at one point, the border between Mexico and the US was a soft border before they had a wall. And we see the Canadian-US border as a soft border too. But the potential for fortification, the potential for militarization is really here. There are some reports by DHS that show plans for that type of selective fencing or selective fortification. And we do need to take that into account when we assess the border. That border, and especially the border between Quebec and the US, is not a given. It could change fast enough if something, a tragedy, whatever tragedy were to happen, something from Canada impacting the US. So in the circumstances, the current circumstances and what's going on in the world, I would be very adamant to tell our government to be really aware that our border is a fragile line, a fragile ecosystem, and that we really need to address it in a wider way than the solely economic aspects of the border.
Wow, thank you for this answer and for all of these clarifications. I love this expression, borders are a fragile ecosystem. So thank you for sharing this expression with us. Elisabeth Vallet, my new question is about the border walls or border fences. What is a border wall or border fences? And why are we seeing more and more of them erected in the globalized world? It sounds a huge contradiction.
Absolutely. I've started working on that project right after 9/11. And at that time, we were still into this utopia of a borderless world, right? And you could hear, mainly in political science, I think geographers were more grounded in a way, but you could hear those discourses about the end of sovereignty, the end of the nation state, a borderless world. And at the same time, you're right. Right after 9/11, we could already see border fences and border walls being constructed in the world. And you're right to ask the question. The terminology is absolutely crucial. So we came down to that definition that a border wall is a fixed border infrastructure that is designed to prevent certain flows. And it can have many connotations, of course, and you've heard the words walls, fences, barriers, sometimes for the same infrastructure. So we came down to the idea that the word wall was the one we needed because it is meant to wall in or wall out certain flows. And the wall differs from the border in essentially 3 or 4 ways. One, it's unilateral, where border is bilateral, a border is unilateral. So it will not be built most of the time on the borderline, but slightly inland, which has some impact, of course. So it follows the demarcation line, but remains in the sovereign territory of the constructing states. The wall only encompasses a physical aspect of the border. So it reduces the border to one dimension. And whereas by definition, a border is a connection, the wall is exactly the opposite. It makes the juncture hard and seal. And lastly, the concept of the wall includes actually a surveillance apparatus. And you will see around the wall, on the wall, sensors, border roads, lightning cameras, checkpoints, drones, what have you. Why? Because border walls per se and by themselves do not work. They are not functional. So I'm answering the second part of your question. Why do we have 77 border walls today? Actually, those 77 are those that we have been able to confirm. from 3 different sources, but we have counted 96 of them. Some of them still need to be confirmed. So it's a whole lot of border walling in the world and on every continent. And why do we have so many border walls? Well, the answer may not be in border crossing per se, but more into border theater. So a border wall is first and foremost a symbol, the symbol that you are protecting the state, that you are sanctuarizing your state territory, that you are doing something if you're a politician. It's easy to erect a wall. And we've seen that during the Trump campaign, but Orban has done the same thing in Europe, and we've seen that elsewhere. So it's easy to, it's almost a prêt-à-porter, something that you can show off and say, okay, see, I've done something. It may not work, but I've done it. So it's merely border theater. And the reason why we are building border walls, and there are so many of them today in the world, you could have two levels of analysis. One could be, it's all about identity politics. And we're seeing a lot of those identity politics today in Europe and all the way to Russia, actually. So it's really, who are we, would have said Huntington at the time. And maybe it's answering that question, trying to answer that question in a globalized world. And at the same time, the other level of analysis would be that it's the lack of cooperation that we are seeing as the world order is changing pretty fast. And maybe border walls are actually the canary in the coal mine, meaning that what we've seen, the numbers of them growing up since 9/11, maybe it's just that, the signal that the global order was changing. And what we're seeing today is the result. But border walls were here way before to tell us that actually maybe states weren't trusting each other.
Thank you, Elisabeth Vallet. Could you tell us a little bit more about the effects and impacts of these border fences on borderlands? You just mentioned that in your precedent answer.
Well, border walls divide. They divide borderlands. And as I was telling you earlier, and growing up at the border between France and Switzerland, I can tell you that we still have much more in common as borderlanders than I have with people from Paris, or they have with people from Zurich. There is that very special dish. There is just on the other side of the wall in my office, somebody who is from Geneva, and there is that one dish, un gratin cardon, and she knows what I'm talking about, but she's the only one. Like, most people don't even know what it is because it's super local. So I feel we've got that. Like here in Vermont, people in Burlington, at the University of Burlington in the US, were telling me that they were watching hockey and hockey games on the CBC network. Why? Because they would see the teams they liked, which were the Canadiens, the Maple Leafs. They didn't care about the Golden Knights or, those American team from the West. So they'd be, and plus they'd be watching CBC because there were less advertisement, and the advertisement they'd see, it would be meaningful for them. Or if you listen to the Vermont Public Radio in Quebec, they give you the weather all the way to the St. Laurent Valley, because that's where they look. So we have a lot in common. Border walls tend to create a scar in those borderlands. And the scarification is also economic. As you are limiting the flows or making them more complex due to the border wall, some flows, and even underground economy, but current common borderland underground economy. I'm not talking about organized crime. Well, this is getting more difficult. So you've got those border walls are creating a disjunction between those economies that have to reinvent themselves away from each other. So they definitely divide. They will also divide ecosystems. There is that one study from 2003 from the University of Beijing, and those biologists have discovered that there was a differentiated evolution genetics of plants and animals on both sides of the Great Wall of China, of course, because those big predators cannot go on the other side. Insects stay with them, blah blah blah. And we are seeing that actually. You may have heard of that gray wolf that died at the border with Arizona because it could not cross, or it was linked to the fact that he wanted to cross. So this has an impact that we're seeing even in Kashmir, when black bears actually have been rerouted and actually go through villages, which they didn't used to do before, and attack people. So, and because they are becoming a threat, they are being shot. So all of this is changing the borderlands. And the mistake, I think, that is being done by governments is to think that borderlands are a vivier, a place where a danger happens. Whereas you could see borderlands as mangroves, as places that actually absorb like the threats, like the bayou do in Louisiana with hurricanes. You could see that way. And in fact, that was the case. Yes, there used to be smuggling in Stansted in that little village, which is on the line between Vermont and Quebec. But at the same time, there was that citizen surveillance of the flows. So there are many ways to see borderlands, and I think the wall is reducing borderlands, is making it more rigid, whereas its very first quality was to be soft and absorbing.
Thank you, Elisabeth Vallet, for all this presentation of the complexity of borderlands. Amazing. Moving on, the next question, if you don't mind, let's talk now about the US-Canada border. What are the specificities of this international border, politically, geographically, culturally, and what are the main issues of this border, and maybe also the next challenges?
Good question. The border has been thought and said to have been the least militarized, most peaceful border in the world. And in a way, it's not. It's true. It's been, because it has been pacified for a long time. Issues were of low intensity and locally dealt with. 9/11 has changed everything, and the way we see the border, the way the Americans see the border too. So, in a sense, the US-Canada border is, and here Professor Brunet-Jailly was super intuitive in thinking that it could be a good example, a good sample to study the evolution of borders in the world, and it's a nice standpoint to understand and to theorize border, because we have that accessibility of local officials and practices, and also quite a diversity in terms of landscape, geographically speaking, but also linguistically speaking. So that, I think, is what's interesting about the US-Canada border. And you've got those very specific collaborative mechanisms that have been developed over years, over many years, over decades. And at the same time, the rigidification, the thickening of the border following 9/11, which is still going on as we speak, as pre-clearance is getting deeper, as filtering is also getting deeper, and the Trump era has also changed the way we relate to the specific border and the way we think that border. So we know it cannot be taken for granted, that evolution can still take place. And so I think what we've done with the big program was really to develop tools and mechanism to study that specific border, but more globally. And that's why we have that international network now, more globally international borders.
Thanks, Professor Vallet. I would like now to talk about the relationship between the war between Russia and Ukraine and the theme of international borders. The current context is very difficult, as we know. And although we know that international law normally protects borders, we know the principle of integrity of the territory. At the geopolitical level and at the level of academic research, what will this war change in terms of the global context currently? What does this conflict teach us about the issues related to the borders of countries? Some people have spoken of kind of a re-territorialization of borders. So finally, my question is globalization with borderless flows over?
That's a super interesting question. You know that as political scientists, we cannot read the future, right? So this is really a perspective, but
Exactly.
You're right. The way we think globalization is changing. And although somebody like Appadurai would have said, as a sociologist, would have said, be careful, globalization is not constant, homogeneous, it is more complex. So maybe it's the length and the speed of the mechanism of globalization that is decoupling, and maybe we should speak about globalizations, which would be a bit a different take on it. There is a re-globalization or a deglobalization for sure, and we see the some deep fractures in the world, and some ensemble, some group of countries may go at a different speed than others. So yeah, globalization is being redefined as well as the global world order. We know that the repositioning and the reinforcing of NATO, the redefinition of the EU and the way it will have to think itself, and the way it will have to think whether to integrate or not some countries that have applied for a long time. We know that the US leadership, already weakened by Trump, is being redefined. And as we speak, some big decisions are being made with NATO, and this will have an impact on the reputation and the reliability of the Western alliances, for sure. And at the same time, speaking of borders, you're right. The end of the intangibility of borders is something that we will probably have to study and to rethink from a Russian perspective, because we don't know what are the limits of that expansion. But we know that borders are not a problem in the Russian doxa, but also from a Chinese perspective. And what's going on in Southeast Asia will also be redefined through what's happening in Russia. And for instance, border-wise, what has been super interesting is China speaking to the global south and saying, see, the way they treat refugees from Ukraine and the way they treat refugees from elsewhere, this is a different take, a different perspective. So there are, I think, a few takes from what's happening in Ukraine. The end of the intangibility of borders is one, and we have to think in those terms from now on. Even our own borders will need to be assessed from that angle. So that's one thing, the fluidity of certain flows, and refugees being one of those issues. We choose the refugees we want to welcome under international law, which is kind of paradoxical. So we've seen that some flows may go through, some may not, and hence the fact that we have a re-deglobalization process. And thirdly, the redefinition of the world order, which at one point may have an impact on how others will define borders, and those that do not adhere to the liberal order the way we've seen it since 1945. So there are many changes I think we're facing nowadays, and borders, you're right, are at the heart of this. They are consubstantial to globalization. They've always been, because they are what defines globalization, but they will be also the heart of the next world order, whether we think they are intangible or we think we can cross some of them or filter certain flows.
Thank you, Elisabeth Vallet. Throughout this interview, we have seen that borders can be protected by a wall or a fence, but also bypassed by an army. Borders can be violent against people, and armies can be violent against borders, territories, and also people. My last question concerned the geopolitical approach to borders. As you have said, borders are not just lines on the maps. They are real political and legal institutions, complex legal and political object. Between the territorial wars and globalization without borders, how to rethink the border object? What are the theoretical perspectives on the academic research about borders and bordering processes?
That's interesting. I think we've been rethinking borders for now 30 years, since after the Cold War, the end of the Cold War. And borders have become more complex, thicker, more mobile. They've become racist too. They've always been, but it's obviously racist. And Rhys Jones has written a book about white borders, which is super interesting, and from the sole U.S. angle, but that could be reproduced on other borders. Definitely something that we need to think of in terms of how much do we project of our own politics on that very line, and there are a lot to study on that. Borders have become internalized. We see that we are crossing the border earlier and earlier. As you may be going to the US soon, you will have to do a COVID test, and that COVID test is your first step to the border. If you are testing positive, you will not be able to cross the border. So it will be 3 days before, but 3 days before even coming close to the line, you won't cross the line. And borders have been externalized. So the border is starting further and further from the very line, the very border line. Questions that we will have to maybe study and maybe mobilize in a more practical way, because I think we may have a responsibility as scholars to explain and show and tell our governments that a border policy is designed for the border, but that most of the border policies we're seeing now should be first and foremost foreign policy or development aid policy. That actually the hammer we're using is maybe too small. Maybe we should be using policies that should start 2,000 or 3,000 kilometers away, where the real problems are. So what we're doing today with our border policies, a lot of them actually, is putting a Band-Aid on a broken leg. It may hide what's going on, but it won't cure the problem. And as climate change or insecurity, either fostered by climate change or totally independent, as we see now, will change those mobilities, we have to adapt in a way that is functional, humane, which is something that we need to put forward, I think. And so I think as scholars, we both have to theorize, and that's important, but we have to operationalize to make sure that our findings get translated into actual policies. And I think most of the time, most border scholars are seeing the inhuman policies that are being set. And this is probably where we should maybe communicate more or better. And the policy papers are just as important as scholarly and scientific papers, I think.
Thank you, Professor Vallet. Merci beaucoup. We could switch in the French language for the last question and the last answers. So, merci pour tous ces commentaires très instructifs sur les transformations des frontières comme objet, mais aussi les nécessaires transformations des frontières comme objet de recherche. On sait que les frontières ont de plusieurs visages, on sait qu'elles sont en partie des délimitations, on sait aussi que ce sont des systèmes de contrôle, et on sait aussi que c'est des systèmes de coopération, complexe coopération à plusieurs niveaux, coopération internationale, coopération transfrontalière. On sait aussi que la gouvernance transfrontalière vient rajouter un peu de sel dans cette complexité. Bref, la complexité des frontières est indéniable. Je me demandais quelles étaient pour vous les principales caractéristiques d'une frontière en quelques mots. Est-ce que vous pouvez nous partager avec vous ce que vous pensez sur l'objet complexe des frontières en quelques caractéristiques? Merci.
Une frontière, c'est avant tout un point de jonction entre deux souverainetés, entre deux juridictions, entre deux États. Donc, une frontière est presque l'emblème de la coopération. C'est le moment où on décide de tracer une ligne entre nous et de s'accorder sur l'endroit où se rencontrent ces deux juridictions. Donc, on pourrait voir la frontière comme un objet de coopération, un symbole de connexion en quelque sorte. Paradoxalement, dans la période contemporaine, c'est exactement l'opposé que l'on a fini par développer. C'est devenu un objet d'opposition. Et vous avez parlé de violence, un lieu de violence extraordinaire. Les zones frontalières sont des lieux d'expérimentation parce qu'elles sont loin du centre. Alors souvent, c'est là où on a vu des zones de non-droit ou des zones d'exception juridique se développer. Et puis, dans la période récente, les centres ont réinvesti les périphéries en quelque sorte et on a vu le rouleau compresseur de certains États s'appliquer aux frontières de manière extraordinaire. Alors, c'est paradoxal parce que cette frontière, lieu de connexion, est devenue une frontière barrière, une frontière d'opposition. C'était un lieu d'expérimentation et c'est aussi devenu un lieu de violence et de violence infinie, de violence exceptionnelle, ce que l'on voit de plus en plus d'ailleurs dans les univers démocratiques. Et puis, cette projection de cette violence, de cette frontière, s'effectue parfois très loin de la frontière. Donc, cette frontière ligne est devenue une frontière épaisse, c'est une frontière vraiment complexe.
Merci, Professeur Vallet. Do you want to add something to share with our audience?
Well, I would encourage, I assume that a lot of your listeners are students wondering if they want to go further in border studies, and I would encourage them to do so. It is, borders are the heart of the international system of globalization. You can't go wrong if you study borders. But even more than that, the border studies community is actually a fun one because it's not in a silo. We work with people lawyers, we work with biologists, we work with geographers, political scientists, practitioners, theoreticians. This is a fun place to be as a young scholar. So I would encourage your audience to go into border studies, come and meet us and see, go into the Borders in Globalization events and seminars and meet the professors. It's a lot of fun. It's sometimes scary, sometimes it is sad, sometimes field work is a bit difficult. but we're grounded people. It's really an interesting field.
Thank you very much, Professor Elisabeth Vallet. Merci beaucoup, Professeur, pour avoir participé à notre série de podcasts. It was a great discussion on very important and current topics. So thank you very much again. Professor Vallet.
Merci.
Thank you, Professor. This was the Borders and Globalization podcast. Today we were with Elisabeth Vallet, professor at the University of Quebec in Montreal. Thank you for your attention and see you soon for the next issue. Bye bye. Au revoir.
Au revoir.